to chapter 7. And though we did hit it, I'm going to go ahead and read it again just for the record. As well, you understand that this has already proceeded in what is called the chronology because we have Belshazzar's name mentioned, okay? One of the things that I want to, be able to, I think, encourage us in is that this has what we would call a cryptic message. There needs to be an encoding that happens. This can be defined by a word that you're familiar with. I think you're familiar with it, which is enigma. An enigma simply means a mystery. It can't be fully figured out without an effort to solve it. The Rubik's Cube might be to you, as it is to me, an enigma. This little perfectly colored box that has been designed mechanically to turn and twist on all planes in 4 dimensions. And you go, who could have invented that? And then who could it be that solves it? So when those first came out, that was trending. Could it be solved? And of course, little by little, man, woman, child by man, woman, child, it was learned how to solve it. But that wasn't simply where it ended. It not only was a matter of solving it, becoming faster at solving it. More efficient, more effective. How can it be redesigned? But for those of us that never put our hands to it or put our hands to it once and said, who cares, who gives a rip? We toss it up our shoulders. But others are not so easily satisfied until the outcome is, I understand. So what we do understand is that basically was mathematically and scientifically engineered. Somebody had a brilliant mind and civil engineering giftings, and they were able to take the mechanics of the vision and turn it into this little cube. It's called Rubik's Cube after the inventor. And so we have one in our family right now who was not satisfied in just realizing it's an enigma of mechanics. He had to solve it. So that's Zachary. And so he actually can solve a Rubik's Cube. And what's your fastest time, if I may have that? 19 seconds? 19 seconds. So you basically, you throw one in his hand, and this is what he'll do with it. So he'll do one of these things, and jumping jacks, those are always good for him.
Seriously?
A couple of push-ups.
Wow.
Maybe a prayer. I think it's inside his heart. But you toss it to him, all of a sudden.
No way.
And it's done.
Wow.
So the enigma is solved on all of those planes. The colors all agree on each side. But what he was able to share is that it's a mathematical solution. Am I correct in that? It's based on an algorithm. Algorithms are used, they're basically structures of mathematics that are in essence a formula that solves something. So if you understand it, then you can apply that theory of mathematics to anything. Okay, so the reason that I chose to bring that out initially right now is that from 7 really to the conclusion and even much of Revelation, though I think this is much more in that area of an enigma, the mystery that even caused Daniel to tremble, he has to make a connection with the author of this. If you and I sat down with Rubik's, he might be able to explain it much quicker than it took over the successive generations of men that just said, I'm going to learn this thing. And so I'm not saying that everybody that applied themselves to mathematics could solve the cube as fast as Zach. But Zach, there are guys that solve it even faster, am I right?
Yep.
How fast do we have? What's the record?
Like 3.5 seconds.
That's crazy. Zach, we expect better out of you. So, you slacker. So that being said, is that to bring you into more of a contemporary history, on the passage of time, not as far back as Daniel, but what we currently can say, has that ever contributed, in other words, an enigma, to making something perhaps insurmountable to another party of a warring faction? So in Germany in about 1939, they actually began what was called an encoding cryptic system of communication. Hitler was on the rise, and his intention was that what he was doing would not necessarily get out until he had built up an army that would not be able to be argued with and to carry out his strategies. The idea behind encryptic messages aren't necessarily unfamiliar in times. In fact, we would call those people who specialize in transferring information spies. They go in to observe what they see in order to bring back information for what is not known, and then to have a strategy of attack or of defense, offense and defense. So even in our country, it was employed both in the Civil War and it was employed in the Revolutionary War, which preceded that by 100 years. And men actually died by carrying encryptic notice. But some of them also didn't because it was seen and thrown over the shoulder. Didn't make sense. Nathaniel, I believe, I hope I'm right in this, Hawthorne would have been a young teacher who went in as a revolutionary spy into the British encampment to scout out and to observe what the British were doing to bring back information to General Washington. He was caught, and in his shoe was a slip of paper. They were able to determine based on that, in which he didn't quite encrypt to where it didn't have suspicion, so he was hung as a consequence to being a spy. His famous words that you might recall in your study in school was, "I only regret that I had but one life to give for my country." And so, that being said, moving to now this area of our late 30s and early 40s, bringing us into World War II, the Germans actually invented a machine called the Enigma. And if you saw the machine, it would look like a very beefy typewriter, or what we would say in a law clerk, what is that called? Transcriber. When you see in the court of law, they have given kind of a legal means of taking shorthand. And they're really, it's a keypad that has like 6 or 7 keys on it, and they're typing as fast as the person is speaking, and they know how to read ultimately the results. So the Enigma that the Germans built took their 26 letters of the alphabet and it scrambled them. But then somebody else on the other end that would receive this scrambled note had a machine parallel to it or likened to it called the Enigma, and it would unscramble it. But if it got into the hands of the Americans or the French or the British, it couldn't be figured out. So once they realized that they had an advantage by what was not going to be overtly disclosed, they took on territory. And they were able to do things behind the back of the Allies, or if you would, in their face, and they couldn't figure it out. So I'm only spending time on this to say that God is the author of language, and he cannot be surpassed in terms of, if you would, enigmas that are intended to be hidden from the enemy, but intended to have revelation to his own. And in this case, this is revelation to his own, while suspending to some degree what it could mean if it came into enemy hands. That's the idea. Even Revelation. So at some point in time, Daniel will be told, close the book and seal it. That information is not going to be understood for a while. And Revelation seems to be the open book that John was privileged to publish to the churches. So just something fascinating that you can look at. So that's why even in 6, and now exclusively 7 and 8 to the end, it's enigma that we're moving through in symbols. And so let's see if we can not get confused, but simply enjoy the means by which Daniel was able to document this and honestly say, I don't quite understand it. I need help. So that first year, realizing we read it, Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed, and then he wrote down the dream telling the main facts. And you're going to see this repeated not only in this, but also chapter 8 and 9. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. The 4 winds of heaven didn't necessarily hit on this yesterday, more emphasizing the great sea is humanity, but the 4 winds of heaven may be that which is suggested in Hebrews, in which the seraphim are considered as a fire in the heavens, and the winds as angels on dispatch. And so this may be what we would call the influence of angelic majesties in the hidden realm of what we would call the eternal, that area that we're not privileged per se to see, but still interacts with all of humanity. We live in a world right now that has limited tenure and vision and dimension. The eternal is without dimension. It's expressed in one end to the other, top to bottom, without any closure. It's eternal. And so we have eternal creatures that God has designed, in other words, by stratagem and creativity, who serve him and who also serve us. But on the same context, we have those who, in disobedience to God, rebellion, became what we know today as demons, who followed Satan, who was an archangel. So all of this pertains to the work of basically Satan to crush the endeavors of God to save what? You and I, for himself. He figured he had settled that issue back in the garden. Not so. But he's still on the prowl. And even as we see these armies successively being raised up and put down, there will be in the close of Revelation, but also intonating that in Daniel, the annihilation of Satan and his minion, Antichrist, and the false prophet, who are all introduced symbolically here, but ultimately in the same regard in Revelation. So why are we dealing then with empires still? Because God's showing us that empires will rise and fall, and there is a last one that will be vanquished. And that last empire will be set up by Satan, and it will be established on earth. And I think that, as I voiced yesterday, it will be what we can surmise as the new Roman Empire, or the Neo-Roman Empire. Passing through these symbols again, the 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the others. So from the sea of humanity, these beasts arise, and they will do so in succession, Babylon being mentioned in the first one, with the lion, the heart that was given to ultimately Nebuchadnezzar, which was beastly, identifies that. The second beast that was raised up, which was the Medo-Persian Empire, it'll go a little bit longer, have a little bit more earthly influence. It had vanquished 3 enemies before it, Babylon included. After this, in verse 6, the Leopard, which speaks of the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great, who passes away at the age of 33. The wings imply that he did an expeditious conquest. Nobody had taken on the world system as fast as he had done. And then in 7, it's the indicative of the, at that time, Roman Empire. Documented to effectively have had 500 years of supreme power, but certainly moving back beyond that and a little bit after that fact, still influence. Remember, when these empires are coming on the scene, it means they're at the apex of their power, but it doesn't mean that they didn't pre-exist. Even right now, there's an empire that pre-exists, right? Something that isn't just coming up, it's right now conspiring to do something. Now that could be for many reasons, a global community, as we've seen, and as we've also heard the term Antifa. That's a radical anarchist group that wants to have the world their way. And what they've chosen to do, as opposed to change it by peaceful means and democratic methods, they get in your face and they slam a brick in it. They take a rock and they pound your window out. They do violent things to intimidate you on your way of thinking. Your way of thinking isn't wrong. Their way of thinking is, because it's radically against what we would call civility. Everything about it rages against a normal behavioral response to people with differences of opinion. And that's why the believer is to have a great regard for life. And that's why also one of the remarkable things about the Jewish people that we need to understand is they have a remarkable value system of life, which is why, as was explained to one of our family by our pastor friend Carl, who was with us, is that we see them always relent. In other words, not clean the clock, not plaster the enemy, giving acquiescence to the Muslims, the Arabs. You know, that's why when they took over Jerusalem in 67, my mind would say, and many politicians, why, as you routed a four-system government, I mean, you literally took on the entire Arab nation that were against you. Jordan, Arab, Syria, all of these warring factions, Palestinians that were against them, outnumbered them, and the Jews, because of God's sovereignty, cleaned their clock. And they could have come in and said, that temple on our holy mount comes down. They could have totally bulldozed it down. And probably no one would have said anything. Why didn't they? Because in their heart, their desire is to be of peace. Jerusalem is to be established as ultimately a city of peace. God's city of peace. So within them, though they are notorious fighters, and they are good, they're probably the best fighting force ever on the planet. They go in and they know how to perform military surgery. But there's a part of them that if it's not necessary, they will yield and stop shy of literally obliterating a society or historical artifacts. Though what ultimately they receive is a betrayal. The reason that I say that as well is because in 7 and 8, there's going to be brought to our attention one who will rise up on the scene, who will make friends with them. And because the Jewish nature is to be friendly and of peace, and at the same time to establish themselves in the true faith, to be moving and motivated to get God back into their national livelihood they're going to find themselves deluded or seduced by Antichrist. So that'll come out. But right now, panning through the history archives and right now seeing the relevancy of it is that there is yet a kingdom that is to come. It will be very powerful, and it will probably be only established in full when the church is removed. So we'll take a peek at Revelation 4 with regard to that. But what you need to understand is that it would be probably what will notably be the new or Neo-Roman Empire, which will be governed by Antichrist. And where it is going to be, there's conjecture. But there does seem to be evidence that as we're plowing through this right now, and you can just put this down, the Antichrist will have three capitals that seem to be linked with what is mentioned in Revelation as well as what is implied right now in our study. And the political capital will be literally Rome itself, historical Rome. Again, this is conjecture, could be argued, but I think it's reasonable. That politically, the Antichrist will have a capital established in Rome. Jerusalem, the Antichrist will have a capital established for religious purposes. Because right now what Jerusalem represents from the Jewish perspective is a cup of trembling, according to Jeremiah. The world has just got its eye on Jerusalem. And there will be a major war with regard to that, but it's going to be what would be considered the hub of a religious capital. Rome, a political capital. Jerusalem, a religious capital. Why? It makes sense, doesn't it? There are three dramatic faiths that right now place an emphasis on Jerusalem. And that would be the Muslims, and that would be the Christians, and that would be the Jews. It, of course, is the Jews. But out of the three major religions, and that means dominating forces of power in the spirit, those are the three. It makes sense that that is very likely going to happen. And then Babylon, that we are now kind of not only immersed in, but kind of getting out of that water right now, that is going to be the economic capital of the Antichrist world system. Because Babylon's going to be mentioned as a harlot and as one in which a city of commerce will be forged from it. So that's important because right now, one of the attentions that we get as a nation is what? Wall Street. And you'll remember that what happened in 9/11 of 2001, the Twin Towers, which represented the entire economic power structure of the monetary system, came crashing down as a result of terrorists opposed to the work of the United States of America, and literally opposed to the world that was not seeing religiously on their terms what they want to do, and that's bring the world into subjection. So it was definitely an Islamic attack. There's no doubt about it. Its intention was to bring the U.S. to its knees and to stop the world trade system, to literally cause not a pandemic, but an economic depression, to stop every aspect of commerce. So that right now, we're looking back at 20 years, 3,000 lives dying in an inferno in which you want to talk about a high rise over 100 feet, 100 stories, came crashing down, one after the other. And it was methodically and maliciously planned. And it was horrific. So if you think that is something that will go down in the annals of evil, a sinister act that basically quenched a very effective and efficient world system. It will not compare to what Antichrist will do. There were three jets involved, and the Antichrist will have more weaponry in the dark areas of the spirit than what that represents. So just food for thought as you ponder that with regard to what is really being, inspired here. This is fearful stuff. We can say, on just the evidence here, yeah, but I can't really get into that, javelins, spears, bows and arrows, swords, rocks, massive armies with guys that clench their teeth and look pretty bad coming from a gym. Can't really get into that. But God would say, but I can. Because at the time there was none more formidable than these, and at the same time, not greater than me. They folded. But I'm just simply saying that though you were not appreciably able to dial in on 9/11, I was. I came out of missions. We were spending one night over, I think in Sacramento, but I don't remember where. And as we opened up our morning and clicked the TV channel after devotions, the Twin Towers, and it seemed that the world had stopped, and commentators on the news were crying, and people in the streets were covered in blood and dust. So it is important that you understand that there's another empire on the rise. And even as it seems as though on a world stage we're all getting along fine, yeah, we're all learning how to solve the Rubik's Cube. Yeah, computers have drawn us in together. And that's precisely actually what the Antichrist's purpose is to come in on a stage that already has been set, in which the actors are already reading from the same script. If you were to read in Hebrew and I were to read in English and another person was to read in French and continue on in dialects Italian, and it's the same play but we're reading from different manuscripts in those languages, we would all come away from it going, huh? What was that about? Because nothing would make sense to our ears and minds. So what's happening right now behind the scenes, and we know this, it has to be true, based on when Israel established itself, now moving into the 73rd year, Antichrist wants to come into a play in which the stage is set, and in which his voice is going to be irrefutably and inarguably believed in and people submitted to. Because all of a sudden the cacophony of noise from different languages will all of a sudden be completely irrelevant. Everybody's going to have a language of understanding in the areas of politics, in the areas of religion, because what's going to happen is that religion is going to be something that will be ignored until it's something that everybody can believe in under one central focus. So when you see the church being attacked, you need to understand it's for the purpose of getting rid of it being an influence, so that as the stage on politics, the stage of religion, the stage of economic independence and power can be all under one central figure, a person of authority, who will then have all the armies of the world under his dominion, dispatched to be able to say, we're coming after Israel. We're going to get rid of God. And of course we live in a land that's going to be played out on, brokered on. So again, my redundancy here right now is simply to say, It's important, and yeah, I know that in the regard of the cryptic language and the pictures, we can say, man, if God just would have written out just a little bit easier, But we have to have these commentators. But God doesn't mind us at all striving to glean and to understand, and also to say in the simplicity, even of just this, better understanding comes as another day breaks. As the headlines proclaim something, how does the Word of God already prepare us for it, or to, if you would, encourage us through it? We're either being prepared for it or encouraged in it, through it, to get by. So that's why we're doing this. So when we left off, 9 and 10 and 11 was simply the Lord bringing himself into this vision. Daniel understood it very clearly. The Triunity of God represented in the Ancient of Days, the throne of heaven being displayed, put in place, seated, garments of white. Daniel's being privileged to see what actually we don't really have an understanding of. I mean, we've all tried to imagine it. Because we weren't here when Jesus walked the earth, what was it like? And even those guys don't fully. I do believe that after the Lord died and rose, their motivation would have been highly linked to the remembrance of Jesus. But it is interesting because you can't get anybody to give you the exact representation of Jesus. And you kind of have to say, come on, guys, 12 of you? Paul, you saw him face to face. He tutored you 3 years in the desert after you were dressed concerning your pride. None of you were artists. None of you could have given us the picture of Jesus. And so we see these representations and all of these efforts to give us the image of Jesus. And the bottom line is this: God says, see me with your heart. See me with your heart. We know that he was a Jew, therefore it must be that indeed he had the traits of a Jewish man. But to really pinpoint it, and that's why God says, as you see me with your heart, you have seen me. And as you have seen me, you've seen the Father. But then all of a sudden we come up with these enigmas of disclosure. And it kind of like, okay, so you're going to be like Santa on a chair, and you got a beard, and there's going to be not a red robe, but a white robe. God's just simply trying to make a connection on a human level that helps inspire you. That he's not this invisible blob. He's not this thing simply in the sky. And we will know it when we are there. But Jesus says, as you know me, you know the Father. You've seen him. So pretty cool with regard to that. So that's what unfolds right now. For Daniel, this would have been highly encouraging because he, as he moves through his agedness, he sees again right now his heart ultimately living for the hope that Israel will be moved back into Jerusalem, and I would no doubt believe that he's hoping he's getting that ride back, ready to make that walk back of 900 miles. So even for you and I, God knows how to motivate us beyond depression, beyond what we would say is qualification. To say that Daniel right now being over 84, at least 84, is being encouraged by these revelations of God. You're doing it, Daniel. You got this thing. Oh, there's another fearful vision coming, but you got this thing. You're doing well. And so when you get down to verse 11 where it says, I watched them because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, this moves us back into that cryptic language. This kind of like, where's that coming from and what does it mean? So very likely right now, this is the beginning of where Daniel's having to piece together this figure who will come again out of the new Roman Empire and be noted, as we will see in Revelation, as the Antichrist, this particular figure. Though it applies to the empire that we're leaving behind, it has implication to one who's still coming. It may also have implications historically to another figure on the scene who will come out of the Grecian Empire when Alexander dies. And where that empire is split between four generals, there's one whose name is Seleucid, and he's got power, and he's been given dominion over Jerusalem. And one will come from his basically tenure as presiding governor over that area, and he will be known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And he would be what's called a pre-type of the Antichrist. He was notorious. His whole goal was to completely erase the foundations of Judaism to bring in Grecian paganism. And so, as you've heard before in your studies, he was one who would come into this, what would be noted as the second temple, Zerubbabel's, and he would be desecrating it. And he would be committing heinous crimes against the public, the innocent public. He would amass an army of over 20,000 that would come in and pulverize the religious heritage of the people until one man of God and his family stood up. And so historically what you need to know is that's the Maccabean revolt, in which these guys said they're not going to impose this on us. For God, we will defend this place and we will die for this place. And it's an extraordinary story of how this one family, this father with sons, it wielded the sword, inspired a nation to not take at rest what Antiochus Epiphanes was doing. And ultimately, the motivation of that was when Antiochus Epiphanes moved into the temple and desecrated with the slaughter of a pig, and asked then in a statue that was put in the temple for him to be worshipped. It's the same scenario in a pre-advance of what Antichrist will do. He'll befriend the nation of Israel to build what they do not have presently, which is a temple, to institute worship, which is their heart's desire. And Revelation will tell us that in the contract that was forged in the 3.5 years following it, he will turn against them, and he'll do exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did. The difference is Antiochus Epiphanes only had influence over this one sector. The Antichrist will have influence over the entire world, will be his stage, his production. And so what has to happen then? The Lord, Jesus, will make an appearance. When what happens? There is the judgment of God the Father upon a world that he loved, who now is Christ rejecting, and the wrath of God will be poured out upon the world. That's where Antiochus Epiphanes, historically, he fades, because it measures up nothing compared to what the assault will be on Antichrist. But it also pales in comparison to anything you've heard now in terms of what Antichrist's assault will be on those who have been left behind, which are the Jewish nations and those of the Gentile community who have become believers. A church, if you would, that will be underground. So we're going to go ahead and break.